Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Rosenblatt, and I'm an associate professor of sociology here at Loyola. And I've been working with Curl and LCBH on various projects related to Chicago evictions for the past few years. And we're excited to be here to share some of this work with you today, particularly focusing on some recent work we've done and the impacts of COVID on what to think about with eviction filings in Chicago. I guess, Grace, should we start the slides?
Sure.
I guess thinking about the chat, we thought it might work well for if you have a question that comes up as we're talking, to enter it into the chat, and then we can use those at the end. We've left time for Q&A, and we can use the chat questions at the end to kind of start getting that going. So we're going to try it that way. We won't necessarily be monitoring the chat as we're going, but as a place to start when we get to the end of the presentation. So yeah, as I said, we're focusing on Chicago eviction filings and particularly on the impact of COVID-19. Let me see, what is that? Can we go to the next slide? Grace? Yeah, so I'll just give a brief overview. In a moment, we'll introduce ourselves. And then get into talking about this really interesting data source that LCBH has been sort of collecting, gathering over the past handful of years, and the different things we've been able to do with it. So we'll get a really great preview of or look into the data portal that they've put together that you all can access as well. It's online. We'll talk a little bit about the partnership between Curl and LCBH, a little bit on some of the more recent updates to eviction-related issues since the data portal has launched. And then we'll get into some of the new research, some things Grace has been putting together, again, focusing on data and getting it into people's hands to help with sort of thinking about and acting on evictions in Chicago. And then we'll get into some of the things we've been doing, focusing on with looking at the impact of COVID, and particularly the COVID-related economic shutdown and spikes in unemployment, and how that's impacted or may have impacted eviction filings in Chicago. And then we'll close out with a Q&A. So I guess we can go on to introductions. One thing I'll mention briefly before turning it over to Mark is just to acknowledge, I want to acknowledge other folks at Loyola who've been involved in this research. Gina Spitz is our assistant research professor, I think, at Curl. Travis Moody, who's a graduate student in sociology. Emily Drain, who's an undergraduate sociology major, and Isabel Abbott, who is a recent Loyola graduate. Yes, Mark.
Thanks, Peter. My name is Mark Swartz, and I'm the executive director at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. And I'm also an attorney, and we're a legal aid agency in Chicago that represents low-income and working-class renters. We do a lot of work in eviction court, and that's how we got interested and involved in the data. Randall?
My name is Randall Leurquin, and I work on various projects at LCBH. I myself am not an attorney. But one of my big projects was all of this eviction data and setting up the data portal and getting these reports out.
Hi, I'm Grace Rock, and I am the Data and Technology VISTA at LCBH. And for the past year, almost a year or so, I've been working with Randall on making our data more efficient. And I also was a former Curl undergrad student.
So I'm going to kick it off with a brief overview of the Chicago Evictions Data Portal. We launched it last May 2019. It's available online at eviction.lcbh.org. When we released, it has 29 different data points that we present for Chicago and We have breakdowns by community areas as well as the Chicago wards. And some of the key findings, we also produced 3 short narrative reports. And the key findings from those, we saw an average of more than 2,300 eviction filings per year, or just over 3.9 eviction filings per 100 rental units. And in human terms, that's about 1 in 25 renters and their families faced eviction each of those years. We also found some troubling disparities in eviction filing rates when we looked at the racial composition of community areas. And the map, the dark colored community areas are the majority African-American community areas, and the larger gold circles are the higher eviction filing rates. So it was pretty startling. We also looked at the reasons for eviction, and for the most part, it's due to rent not being paid. And we looked at this, and it's for relatively small amounts of money for most cases, over 2/3 for less than $2,500. And then there was a vast imbalance in who has representation. Landlords had attorneys 79% of the time, while tenants only had attorneys 11% of the time. And then by having an attorney, tenants decreased their odds of getting an eviction order by about 25%. And then legal aid representation, which is particularly important to LCBH as a legal aid provider, we resulted in eviction orders only 22% of the time, so about less than half the rate of our private attorney counterparts.
So when we first started our data work, we wanted to partner with academics and others to, well, first to ensure the quality of the data and also help direct our inquiries, what variables we might be interested in looking at. And so Curl was one of the first partners that we had at the table while we were working through this all in the beginning. And they've remained strong partners, assisting us not only in reviewing, the data that we're pulling and making sure that it's, all accurate and, there aren't any issues with it, but also helping provide some original research. And Peter's going to talk a bit about that, namely, some predictive models for what's going to happen when the eviction courts open up again. So what's happened since the, we started doing this work? There have been some recent and interesting developments in the law that I think are really positive and significant. And it's unusual that there are any real developments or movement in eviction law. It's a slow process, and it's really sort of a little antiquated. But in the past year, some really big changes have occurred. And I would like to think that some of these changes are informed by the data project. And I know this is the case because LCBH was, central to a couple of these changes, and our work and our policy work is informed, by the data project and what we understand from the data. So there are 2 big legislative or administrative changes I want to address. The first is the Chicago Fair Notice Ordinance, and this is a new law that only protects Chicago renters and only Chicago renters that are most Chicago renters, but there's a carve out for ma and pa landlords. So if you're living in a smaller building, 6 units or less, and the landlord lives in that building, you don't get these protections. And the first thing it does is it provides for additional notice when a landlord intends to raise the rent or to not renew the lease. And for most folks, if you're living in Chicago, if you're living anywhere in the country, really, you can have your lease terminated on 30 days notice unless your lease term goes longer. And you can have your lease, the rent go up, and there's no bar to how much they can raise the rent. The landlords can raise the rent so long as you're on a month-to-month lease. I mean, the landlord has to honor the lease term, but there really isn't a lot of protections for renters if they're month-to-month in terms of whether they're going to be able to remain in the unit. And this law allows for an additional 60 days notice if you've lived in the apartment for less than 6 months. And if you're there for any length of time, I think it goes up to 120 days. But the really big paradigm shift here is an absolute right to cure up until the eviction order is entered for people that are being brought into eviction court for non-payment of rent. So the law abhors a forfeiture generally, which means that if a tenant, well, not a tenant, but if a homeowner can come current in a foreclosure action, for instance, they have a right to redeem and they're not going to lose the property. But in eviction law, if a tenant is a day late with paying the rent after they get a 5-day notice, again, now in Chicago, it's going to be a little longer. If they get, well, actually, no, not for the notice for non-payment, I'm sorry. But if they're a day late for the non-payment of rent, they can't cure it at all. There's no way that they can come current with the rent unless the landlord agrees to take the rent. So this absolute right to cure provides that a tenant can actually, if they can cure and pay the back rent owed, they can stay in the apartment and the eviction will have to be dismissed. So that's really huge. The second rule change is an administrative rule change, a Supreme Court rule change, Rule 139, which now requires that if an eviction is filed, it's going to have attached to it the notice or relevant lease terms. So what that means is before, an eviction is more of a form notice, and we don't really necessarily understand from looking at the notice, from looking at the eviction complaint, why the tenant's being evicted, because it can just say, you know, the tenant's being evicted for violation of a lease and we want possession, give us possession. But with the notices, we'll actually get some more details about why the landlord is alleging that the tenant's at default, and we'll be able to then look at the notices, understand the background behind the eviction. It will help legal aid attorneys triage cases, and we'll know better what cases to take and what not to take. So this is also a real big game changer. It's going to allow us to more intelligently take the cases that need to be taken. I think that both of these, this law and this Supreme Court rule, are going to change probably significantly what we're going to see in eviction court in the future, both what kinds of cases are filed, because I think landlords are going to be disincentivized from filing cases if they know that they can be cured up until the eviction order is entered, because I think there's a lot of rental assistance that can come to bear to assist renters so they can remain in the unit. And then the notice and lease being attached to the complaint will add more additional details that will make, I think, the data a lot more robust, and also it will help legal aid know which cases to take, which I think will change some of the outcomes. The final change that's happened since the data project was published by LCBH is we've been included in the Chicago Housing and Health Dashboard, and we provide a link here, but our data, along with a number of other data points, are included in this health dashboard. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about our new research and data and some of the reports that we will be releasing soon. So we will be releasing our 2018-2019 data, which has shown a continual decline in eviction filings. We will also be releasing that in tandem with this report on the relationship between eviction filings and unemployment rate, which Peter is gonna cover later in the presentation. And then we've also been working on 2020 real-time eviction reports. And most of our data is based on completed evictions that have been completed in the courts. And this is really our first delve into reporting evictions in real time. So we have been making these monthly and weekly eviction filing tracking reports, and they are also made for community areas and wards. And these are showing the real numbers of evictions that have happened in 2020. And you can see this massive decrease when the moratorium started in April. And then you can also click on the wards here, or the community areas, and see how the evictions are happening in that ward. how many have happened, how much they've decreased, and their ranking in comparison to other community areas or wards. And you can really see where evictions are still happening this year. And yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to discuss what these data we've been hearing about can tell us about the impact of COVID-19, particularly the COVID-19 economic impacts on eviction filings, right? So I'm going to start with this graph, which looks at a monthly breakdown of evictions filed in Chicago going back to January of 2010. And overall, there have been close to 250,000 residential eviction filings during this past decade. That's not including commercial evictions filed against commercial buildings or commercial landlords, commercial non-residential tenants, that's what I should say. So there are three things I want to point out with this graph. First is the spikiness of it, right? There's a seasonal fluctuation in evictions. There are fewer evictions filed in the winter and more in the summer and fall. And there could be a number of explanations for this. One thing that sort of leading thing comes to mind is the sheriff's department that doesn't carry out evictions when the weather is cold, I think below freezing, and also puts a hold on evictions in the 2 weeks before Christmas. And this is a separate process from the courts, or at least from filing, but landlords are aware of sheriff's department's rules and so may be less likely to file in the winter. Second thing I want to point out with this graph is this overall trend of decline, right? And it's something you can see in the data Randall presented as well, right? Generally, the sort of rate of evictions has fallen per month over the past decade. And so and one of the things that we've been exploring is the relationship between this trend and unemployment. The unemployment rate has also fallen over the past decade. And in fact, we put together a model of the relationship between eviction and unemployment using the model is sort of shown here on the left side of the slide, focusing on the relationship between a 1 month lagged unemployment rate and evictions, monthly eviction filing rate across this time. And our model controls for season, because that's a factor here, and also for year. And I want to make sure I acknowledge Christian Paredes in the Sociology department for his assistance in coming up with this model. And so we do find a significant relationship between evictions and the monthly lagged unemployment rate. And that is the unemployment rate from the previous month. And this model is really helpful when it comes to the third thing I want to point out with this graph, which is this dramatic fall off in eviction filings in 2020. And when the COVID-related shutdown began in March, right, the court first started rescheduling pending cases as we were starting to institute social distancing. And then in April, as Grace mentioned, Governor Pritzker issued a statewide moratorium on eviction filings, and that moratorium has been renewed every month since then. But while there's a moratorium on eviction filings, tenants are still responsible for their rent, right? So this means that whenever the moratorium ends, tenants may find themselves owing a significant amount in back rent. And at this point, landlords may well file an eviction, right? And so it really leaves this question of how many renters will be in this situation, how many eviction filings are we talking about? And this is an issue that has a lot of people worried, not just in Chicago, but across the country. And just to sort of add to it, right, the situation is compounded by the huge increase in unemployment that's followed the COVID-19 related shutdown. Tens of thousands of Chicagoans have lost their jobs, millions of people across America. And so these raised these questions since the spring and summer in sort of housing communities and neighborhoods. Will there be a tsunami of evictions, a spike? What kind of thing are we going to face once this moratorium lifts? And so we sort of realized we could use the model we've been talking about the relationship between unemployment and eviction filings to try to address this issue. So Grace, could you go to the next slide, please? So first, this is looking at the actual number of evictions filed since January of this year. And we can see, as Grace mentioned previously, that drop off in March and especially in April as the moratorium go into effect. And then just click forward, please. Yeah, and then this is what we get from our model and our estimates of the number of predicted eviction filings based on previous month's unemployment rate and controlling for season and year. Yeah, thanks. No, you can go ahead to that one actually, because so for most of these predictions, we've been able to use Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers on the unemployment rate for Chicago. But for the last 3 months of our predictions, we've had to estimate. We don't know what the employment rate is or what the employment rate has been, I think, in September from the BLS, and also what it'll be going forward. So we just looked at a couple of different potential, we looked at national predictions, and then also sort of ended up with a plus and minus of 3% of the unemployment rate. So the bright blue bars are unemployment rates 3 percentage points lower, and the darker blue bars are unemployment rates 3 percentage points higher than our sort of initial estimate just for these last 3 months. So if we total up, yeah, we can go back for a second. If we total up the bars here, the light blue, we get a total of 21,400 possible eviction filings that could be filed as soon as January from where we stand right now. And there's a range, the plus and minus due to this adjustment over the last 3 months is about 700 or so, higher or lower on that, depending on variations in the unemployment rate over the last 3 months. So just to highlight, right, the monthly average in eviction filings at the start of the year was 1,500 eviction filings per month. Our estimates are looking at when the moratorium ends, we could be talking about 21,000 filed over 1 or 2 months, right, in the middle of an ongoing pandemic. So this is obviously a big concern, right? And what we're going to talk about now is some of the reasons, right? Will all these 21,000 evictions be filed when the moratorium lifts? We have some reasons to think the number might be lower, and some interesting discussions of policies that can or are being put into place that might help us avoid this scenario. So yeah, thanks. The first thing I want to point to is going back a second to that graph. Yeah, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was the unemployment insurance supplement that was available over the summer. So when we first started looking at this, it was in the spring and early summer, and this was the time when Congress in late March had passed the Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, CARES, CARES Act. And this was the congressional action that sent out the stimulus check to most households in the country. It also, as you may be familiar with, provided a supplement to unemployment insurance for people who had lost their jobs related to COVID-19. And this increased existing unemployment insurance benefits by an additional $600 a week. So with this extra money available, it seemed to us that this could be something people might be able to apply towards their rent, right? So we put together 2 additional estimates shown here by the dotted lines of how the CARES unemployment insurance supplement might reduce the number of evictions that were filed. So the first, this top line, this sort of dark blue dashed line shows the estimate of monthly eviction files, how it might decline if we assume that households who get the minimum monthly unemployment insurance plus the $600 CARES supplement would be able to avoid evictions. And we use some numbers from Turner Center in Berkeley and the IHS at DePaul to come up with an estimate of what would be an affordable rent, and to look back in the data about the proportion of evictions filed for that rent or less. For the dark blue bars, it was people who received the minimum monthly unemployment insurance plus the $600 CARES supplement. We estimated an affordable rent for them would be $735, and we looked at the reduction, reduced our estimates by the number of evictions sort of historically filed for a back rent of $735 or less. And then we did the same kind of thing, but for the number of monthly eviction, for the amount of money that people who get the maximum monthly unemployment insurance plus the UI supplement benefit might get. And so there it's a more money going to people. It's a larger, we estimated a larger reduction in the number of evictions that could be filed due to people having this supplement. So basically these estimates, the dark blue and the red line here, give us a kind of upper and lower bound on how many eviction filings might have been forestalled by the unemployment insurance supplement provisions of the CARES Act. And the total number across these 5 months is about 680 fewer evictions filed if we just look at the minimum amount of the supplement, and 3,300 fewer evictions filed if we look at the maximum amount of the supplement. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but basically there are two things to point out from this graph. First, the CARES Act unemployment insurance supplement could potentially have made a significant dent in the number of evictions we would see filed, right? So while this wasn't specifically designed as an eviction mitigation program, it shows the possibilities of federal policy in potentially reducing the magnitude of eviction filings, right? So that's the good news, as it were. The bad news here is, of course, that our estimates end in July, and this is because the program still has not been renewed, right? Whatever benefits, the other side of this is whatever benefits to forestalling eviction filings that might have come about because of the UI supplement are likely not going to last into January or whenever the moratoriums end, right? Especially, at least for those who are unable to find employment after the supplement ended, right? So this is something that could potentially have made a big reduction in the number of filed evictions that we estimate, but hasn't been continued now, and I'm not sure how much of an impact we'd see whenever the moratorium resumes or ends, whenever the moratorium ends. So I think we're going to talk about some other factors, though, that might mean that we do see fewer evictions filed.
Do you want me to handle the moratorium?
Do you want to add anything about the moratoria?
I mean, I think you pretty much covered it. Just for clarity, the moratorium currently extends through to November 14th. The state moratorium the governor issued, and he only has authority to extend it every 30 months. So while it's an open question about whether it will continue to be extended, a lot of advocates think it will be extended because the CARES Act emergency rental assistance money that the Illinois Housing Development Authority is doling out to people, and it's 150 million worth, is still in process. They've only distributed maybe about a third or a half of the money that needs to be distributed. And so it just doesn't make sense for them not to continue the moratorium, so that this money can come out, which we think will also assist in reducing eviction filings. But additionally, there is a federal moratorium through the CDC, which goes until the end of the year. It doesn't apply to Illinois right now because Illinois has better protections, but that would also kick in if the state moratorium went away.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So we had two really substantial rental assistance programs. In Chicago, we had 20 million from CARES Act with additional 13 million from local sources. And then in the state, we had 150 million. That program wanted to help about 30,000 renters. Apparently there were about 80,000 applications. We have no idea how many of those applicants were from Chicago or how many of them who were granted funds were in Chicago. Currently, there's actually been not very much reporting on any of the results of these two programs yet. And then in Chicago, there's only been one post that said there were 12,000 applicants, which seems very short. So I'm not sure of the accuracy of that. That is the case, that would be about 100% got granted. So, but that program was expected to help about 10, 12,000 people as well. Grace?
And then these next three factors are more focused on renters taking it into their own hands. So some have established payment plans with their landlords to catch up on rent, and this can be made more difficult if they may not have a steady stream of income. And then another one is paying rent with credit, which also generates real concerns about the debt that one can kind of rack up doing that. And then the next one are move outs, where some renters have just already moved out of an apartment that they know that they can't keep paying rent on. So
it's a little uncertain, what's going to happen when the eviction courts open up again in earnest. Will landlords file? We know that there's been an uptick in reports of self-help evictions, either illegal lockouts or constructive illegal lockouts, where landlords are refusing to maintain the property or keep the utilities on because they're saying, well, they're not getting rent, they can't afford to, maintain the properties. There also is an exception to the eviction, the state eviction moratorium for public health or safety concerns, and it's unclear how many of the things of the evictions that are currently being filed now are legitimately filed under that exception, or whether they're being filed because people don't realize that the moratorium's in place, or whether they're trying to overreach in applying the exception for these evictions. But when you look at the number of evictions that are being filed, there is a lot of desire for people to for landlords to get tenants out, and I think that many of these filings should not have been filed. We'll have to find out case by case. LCBH is working right now through a Department of Housing grant with the city, also funded through the CARES Act, to do a lot of eviction defense work. And since the eviction courts are currently closed, we're focusing on those cases that have been filed. And we're going to go through and try to contact people and see if we can assist and determine whether these cases should have not been filed under the exception and then get them dismissed.
So we wanted to revisit a key finding that Randall mentioned earlier, which is the racial disparities in eviction filings. And these are significant for, as we're thinking, so both significant generally for understanding the process of eviction filings in Chicago, but also for understanding how the COVID-related impact on filings might play out in the city. So as Randall showed this map earlier, right, it's when we first looked, at least for me, when I first looked at a map like this about 3 years ago, we were kind of expecting perhaps that evictions might correlate with neighborhood poverty rates, that is that they be higher in poor neighborhoods. And there is a connection there between neighborhood poverty and eviction. But when we first saw this map, it became, or similar maps, right? It became clear that there's a story about race here, right? Because the pattern of eviction rates really closely mirrors citywide patterns of racial segregation, particularly that eviction rates are higher in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And right, just to remind us of what the map shows, the gold circles here are the eviction rate per unit, per 100 units of rental housing. And so that kind of sort of controls for the presence, the amount of rental housing in a neighborhood. So we aren't just seeing high numbers of evictions because there are also high numbers of rentals, right? It's sort of per 100 units of rental housing. So we go on to the next slide, Grace. If we look at this sort of summarized by neighborhood racial composition, it's really the sort of center bars here that I want to center columns that I want to point to. Overall, right, the rates of eviction filing are twice as high, especially 2017, twice as high in majority Latinx neighborhoods than in majority white neighborhoods, and 4 times as high in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white neighborhoods. So one thing we're doing is exploring this racial disparity in greater detail, both quantitatively and through some interviews. But today I want to focus again on how this relates to the topic of COVID, right? So one thing is that we know evictions are already disproportionately filed in majority Black neighborhoods. So we're sort of starting from a position of racial disparities. And what we've also seen is higher rates of job loss from the pandemic among Latinx and Black households. Grace, could you go to the next slide? Thanks. Right. So since I guess since the summer, the Census Bureau started doing this national survey called a Household Pulse Survey. And it's sort of weekly or bi-weekly survey. It's shifted recently. And it's just sort of how US households are faring on a number of different dimensions during the pandemic. So these are numbers for the Chicago metropolitan area as a whole from the most recent Household Pulse survey. So first, you can look at job loss, this figure on the left, the proportion of households of different racial backgrounds that have lost jobs since March. And we can see the numbers are higher in among Hispanic Latinx households than than white households, and also higher among Black households than white households. So more job loss or higher proportions of job loss among Latinx and Black households compared to whites. And then also the Pulse survey asks about housing instability in various ways. So we have here is the proportion from this most recent survey that report being behind on rent. And we see it's over a third of Black households compared to 12% of white households and 6% of Latinx households. And yeah, not to sort of get too much into the weeds, these are sort of, whereas the census asks potentially everybody, this is a subsample, and so there's issues of non-response, and it would be helpful to present these numbers with sort of errors, standard errors, plus or minus, but I actually wasn't able to, when I tried to download those in creating this slide, I got an error message from the census. So I think this gives us an insight. I don't know how ironclad these estimates should be taken, but certainly certain important insight into how households of different racial backgrounds are faring during the pandemic. So we can go on to the next slide, Grace, which is, oh, sorry, just the one back. There's just another detail of housing instability by race in the Chicago metro area, right? This is just asking the proportion of survey respondents of different races who express slight or no confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent. And again, it's higher, more than a third of African-American households in the Chicago metro area compared to about 1 in 5 white households and 16% of Latinx households. So again, taking all of this together, right, both the previous patterns of eviction filings that we've seen from prior years and contemporary data from the pandemic on housing insecurity suggest a potential heavier burden of this this sort of potential spike in eviction filings. That there be a potentially heavier burden of that in Black neighborhoods in particular compared to white neighborhoods. So yeah, next slide. Oh, and these are just some of the different sources that I've mentioned that have some of this information. You can look at the eviction data portal to sort of explore some of these things yourself. There's the link to the household pulse survey if you want to run out and get those standard errors, which I'm sure you're itching to do, and then the housing and health dashboard, which has been mentioned before. So yeah.
So there's been a lot of great reporting and thinking, especially coming out of the results of the new census housing pulse survey, around how many renters are at risk of eviction. And there's a great report, 30 to 40 million renters are at risk. And this is individual renters, so, you know, a whole family of people. Also, in Illinois, it's around 500,000 households are at risk of eviction. And a lot of these are looking sort of at end of year when the CDC moratorium is going to affect, because that's nationally where each state has moratoriums or not, depending on the state. So we look at these numbers, and as Peter noted, our model is sort of suggesting, you know, 20,000-ish. And here we're looking at 500,000 for the state. Our 20,000 is only for Chicago. We know Cook County has about half the rental units in the state, and then Chicago has about 2/3 of that. So, you know, we're talking about 200,000-ish evictions from this at-risk assessment. So why the difference? And we've been talking a lot about this. There's concern that people might misinterpret what we're trying to say. We're not trying to say that it's not as bad as these other reports are suggesting. But we're looking at, these are looking at risk, and we're actually looking at the other side of that, which is, you know, sort of generally termed as harm. In this case, the harm being an eviction filed against you or being evicted, displaced. And we were looking for a good way to talk about this issue. And we don't really have a good foundation when we're talking about eviction in terms of like, well, what percentage of risk do you have in these scenarios? And we know sort of every renter ultimately is at risk of eviction. When your lease ends, if your landlord doesn't want you there, you're out. If you don't pay your rent, of course, you're out. So generally we would say more or less, most renters aren't, the risk is pretty low, right? Most landlords renew their leases, most renters pay their rent on time and that sort of a thing. So we actually looked at the medical fields, and there we think are probably the most advanced in terms of assessing risk. You know, you can go to your doctor and he's going to say, oh, you're at risk for this, that, or the other thing, and you should make changes in your lifestyle, or here's some medications to help you. So we have a lot of preventative and corrective treatments in those fields. When we look at the housing fields, we don't really have doctors per se for renters. So they rely on local housing policies, local laws for those things. In Chicago, we don't have any sort of good cause or just cause. So there's no real remedy for the landlord ending your lease. one good thing in Chicago, as we noted, is the new Fair Notice Act. So you'll be given more time before you lose your home, which is great. And then we know, like, if a building is sold, certainly that would increase your risk of being evicted. What's the new owner's intention? We know from a huge amount of research during the foreclosure crisis that that's a huge increase in your risk to being evicted. So what is the COVID increase? What does that do to your risk of being an eviction? So it's these questions that we're like, how do we talk about these? And ultimately we said, not everyone at risk will be evicted. Another important thing for us to understand is that our data and our look here, ultimately we decided that this would be like actually a great predictive model. So this is going to be a great model for 2022 and 2023 and 2024 when we're trying to understand, what might the eviction rate be then? What sort of resources would we need to sort of prevent more evictions, or to find more resources for attorneys to have, for renters to have attorneys in court? And how does this model actually work in the world of COVID when, everything is out of whack? So, and also another important thing is that we only look at formal eviction filings. There is a vast number of informal evictions. We talked briefly about sort of lockouts. Those are probably the most cruel form, but there's any number of sort of cash for keys type deals. There can be sort of intimidation, that sort of a thing, to get tenants out. More or less, these aren't illegal except for lockouts. There's no real good data here in Chicago on the number of those. The best we have is sort of this great survey out of Milwaukee where Matthew Desmond was doing his work on the evicted book. And their survey suggests that these informal evictions happen twice as often as formal evictions. So if we're looking at 20,000 evictions, we're looking maybe at another 40,000 evictions that aren't actually going to go through the court system. We look at this sort of 20,000 as, we're pretty positive that's the number that's going to be coming at us, and we're going to definitely need these resources. What is going to be the gap for this other quantity of evictions that are going to be related specifically above and beyond because this crisis is so unrelenting and awful? It's a really hard question to answer, and but it's our number is low because it's just simply based on this fairly simple relationship between an unemployment rate and eviction filing rates. So that's. So now I guess that's our formal presentation. We'll open it up to Q&A. Let me, I think I'll read some questions that were in the chat. There was a question about are there any programs to subsidize landlords to prevent evictions? And Mark had actually answered it in that the CARES Act also provided for mortgage forbearance assistance. And even in Illinois, we had $150 million also provided for that. That was pretty substantial. And actually all the emergency rental assistance from the state, it went directly to the landlord. The renters themselves never got that money. So in my mind, that to me is, it's money going directly to the landlords.
And just to clarify, Randall, I mean, there might be some programs where the money flows through the renter. Don't get me wrong.
Oh yeah. No.
But Randall's point is I think the correct one. This money is intended to pay rent arrearages. So ultimately, it's landlord assistance as well as tenant assistance.
There's another question. How might some sort of rent control policy in Chicago impact these numbers? I guess I'm wondering if rent control helps to reduce evictions. I'll let Mark handle that.
Well, this is an easy question because we can't even look to rent control or rent stabilization in Chicago, because currently there's a prohibition at the state level against having municipalities who normally have home rule authority initiate any kind of rent control or rent stabilization. I do think that given the the problem that most low-income renters are having with being incredibly rent burdened, that it's something that should be looked at, because of course it would control the number of eviction filings, because it would make rent more affordable. But of course, there's a lot of policy around it. We can't even get into it because we currently can't pass anything on the local level. There's an initiative called Lift the Ban. A lot of people are working on just getting the ban on rent control lifted so that municipalities can talk about it.
And then there's another question here. Where would all these evicted people go? Seems like a lot of churn in housing. I'll respond and say, absolutely. This is this nightmare question that we all have. Like, we don't have the homelessness resources to handle 20,000 people being put on the street. And yeah, we need some real solution coming out of our federal government to resolve this. And I know everything's at a standstill right now with the election. And so there is great hope and great belief that some additional COVID related relief is in the pipelines. What form that will take, we don't know. Last I heard, there's sort of close to agreeing on $2 trillion. Which buckets they go into is, I think, still a big debate. But yeah, this is a nightmare that we're facing. And if we don't do something, it's going to be bad. How frequently can the governor extend the moratorium? Didn't quite get that. He is allowed to do it every 30 days. So that's why we keep issuing, and that date sort of keeps getting closer and closer. So yeah, the current moratorium, I believe, is through the 14th. And so we expect him to announce, if he is going to extend, probably, the 12th or so. Will there be any changes made to the rental screening process? Because at this point, evictions disqualify renters, and this could lead to chronic homelessness. Mark, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I right now, there's a moratorium on evictions, and so I don't know whether any of the COVID-related evictions are currently disqualifying people that would otherwise qualify for the rental assistance. Going forward, I don't know. I know that. And I don't know if this is actually going to protect people if there's certain screenings that disallow for people that have been evicted from getting rental assistance. But there's a lot of talk that at the next legislative session, which is a veto session, that some people are going to put some emergency legislation in place to try to protect renters who are facing eviction due to COVID. So one of the things that I'm aware of, because we're involved, is to have all of the eviction records that are filed during this time just sealed automatically, so that people aren't impacted, from the filing, because we don't want to blame, the masses of renters that are going to be evicted due to COVID, and have them, have to face additional housing instability because they have something on their record. Whether or not that's going to help in this hypothetical, I don't know, because if they are in fact evicted, then they might have to say yes to that question. I will also say, though, that I don't know if all rental assistance has that disqualification built in. I'm not sure of that. That's not a question I really have a good answer for. But certainly, we're going to, as Randall pointed out, we're going to see a lot of these evictions coming up.
Another question, how might evictions accelerate the gentrification process in Chicago? And I think, Peter, you might be best to handle that.
Yeah, hi, Ashley, thanks. We had done some one of the other research projects we've been exploring with these data was using them to identify landlords to interview. And so back a couple years now, 2018, we with a class of grad students at Loyola, started doing some interviews with landlords around this issue of the sort of association between eviction and gentrification. And there were some interesting processes that we discovered really about how landlords are really developers, right? People who are trying to capture the sort of next hot neighborhood. Where is a good place to invest? You know, what's going to be the next gentrifying hipster neighborhood, whatever. They would focus on buying buildings there where rents were low, and then kind of flipping the buildings, right, which often involved evicting evicting all the tenants and sort of rehabbing the building a little bit, and then you can charge 50% higher rents. Also, you have a new kind of new class of gentrifier who can afford higher rents, right? So this was a process playing out it was described to us in Avondale, which is the sort of just north of Logan Square. Logan Square was a sort of heavily gentrifying area, and Avondale was seen as the next one to be hot, to be gentrifying, right? So their evictions were tied to gentrification through not so much non-payment of rent, at least not in this part of the process, but in the sort of building acquisition and sort of that more, I would imagine, the 30-day notice, right? Just we're taking over the building and we're not going to honor your lease anymore. And so there, it's an interesting connection because it's sort of related to how gentrification is going to progress in the sort of wake of COVID, and how widespread, what's going to happen with sort of property markets, and I'm not really sure how that might play out. So it's an interesting question, right? So I think normally there is sort of normally pre-COVID, there is a connection between gentrification and eviction, where obviously that's preliminary conclusion and we're still exploring it in different ways. But now I'm sort of interested to see how, what is going to be the overall impact of this on the housing market, and gentrification is a piece of that. So yeah, your guess, I'm sure, is as good as mine.
Any more questions? Well, I guess thank you is in order so much. We appreciate your attention. We appreciate your coming and hearing about our work. Thank you.
Thank you.